In our next session, we're going to take a look at Flex configuration. As usually, I'm going to make an overview of this feature. We will take a look at certain components of Flex config, and then I'm going to show you a configuration example. Right, so the main purpose of Flex configuration is to give you the ability of configuring certain ASA features on FTD, features that are not yet supported through FMC, so through the FTD's GUI. And we've got two main use cases for this feature. One is when you do the migration from the ASA to FTD and you want to keep all ASA's functionality up and running on FTD, at least the one that is supported on FTD. But some of those features you are not able to configure, deploy through the FMC. So we've got a bunch of features that you can configure using FMC. And then we've got a bunch of features that you can configure via FlexConfig. And finally, we also have few features that are not supported via FMC or FlexConfig. Of course, those you will not be able to deploy. Now, the second use case is when you are running into a problem. Maybe you do some troubleshooting and you found a need for a certain feature to be enabled or disabled to solve this problem. This would be another example of where you could use Flex configuration. Now, Flex config itself is implemented through so-called policies, where a policy is just a series of Flex config objects. It contains at least one Flex config object, I should say, but it is possible to use more than one, where the Flex config object is composed of 3 elements, where 2 of them are optional. Now, element which is not optional is certainly the actual command line syntax, and it's going to be the same syntax as what you use on the ASA. Now, in terms of the optional components, we've got the scripting language and possibly also variables. Now, variables, you could use them without the scripts. You could use them with or just through the scripting language. It will eventually depend on what you're trying to do. Now, in general, since these are optional, you technically don't have to use them as you define your objects, which will be then called out for the policy. But in some cases, it is going to help if you at least can read the basic scripting syntax. You don't really have to know how to build the scripts, but it would be good to be at least able to read them. Now, you don't have to know how to build them, because as we will see, there is going to be a bunch of predefined objects which already contain the syntax within them. So as long as you understand what the syntax does, you may use those objects and just adjust the syntax to your needs. Now, there is going to be a really good document for this feature. We take a look at the FMC configuration guide. If we go to security and then open the doc for, let's see, Firepower Management Center, this one, I'm going to look for 6.2 config guide, because that's the version that I'm using, 6.2.2. And we will take a look at this section, getting started. There is a document for FlexConfig. And this is a really good source of information for the actual syntax that you will use within the objects, including the variables and also some scripting examples. Now, what I want to show you at this point is gonna be the, let's take a look at the variables. There are actually 4 types of variables that you can deploy, where a goal of a variable in general is gonna be to use them in cases where part of a command or processing instruction depends on runtime information rather than static information. So runtime means that you will take certain information as you deploy the policy. For instance, you will get the maybe interface name or just a management IP address that you know could potentially change at some point. Using variables allows you to refer to the current information, plus you can also treat them as containers for data that you may want to modify at certain points. So instead of using static values, like typically what we do with variables, is going to be just to pretty much make the whole configuration more flexible and easier to manage. That's the main purpose of using variables also with FlexConfig. Now we've got 4 types of those. We've got policy objects, which is something that you will define in the FMC. We've got a bunch of system variables, which are taken from the managed device itself, so our FTD. We have what is known as processing variables, which is something that acts as, I would say, temporary variables for scripts that we run within the objects to finish the processing. We will get back to this topic in just a second. And there is also a variable for certain types of passphrases, like keys. Maybe a key for, let's say, authentication, routing protocol authentication. This would be a good example of where this particular variable could potentially come into play. Okay, now the secret key variables, as you will see in the object config, they will always start with the ADA character, versus all other variables, they will start with a $sign. This is how you refer to those in the configuration in the objects. Okay, now just one more thing about the processing variable, because I mentioned that this one is used as a temporary variable to process a script. So like we have an example here, we want to deploy this particular configuration. We want to enable inspection under class inspection default on the FTD, and we want to enable inspection for a bunch of protocols. So instead of using the inspect and then the protocol name syntax, like if this was real ASA's command, you can define the actual protocols. Like if you think that you may want to change them at some point and be quickly able to make adjustments, you may want to define those in this particular variable, which would make our policy object. And now to use those, as we deploy the syntax to the device with the inspect command, this would make our processing variable. So it essentially, what this syntax means is that, well, this is something that you technically don't define on the FMC. These will be populated automatically as the script is being processed. And this is just so that each value from the actual policy variable can be deployed through the inspect command. So let's say that my policy variable contains 3 protocol names. I've got HTTP, maybe ICMP, and let's say ESMTP. So this is what I want to enable for class inspection default. And now as the loop is being processed, as the script is being processed, which is a loop, it takes HTTP to start the processing. It loads HTTP to this processing variable and then uses the processing variable to deploy the actual syntax. So in the first iteration of this loop, the end result would be this syntax, inspect HTTP. Now, as we go to the second iteration, the processing variable is being used to load the second portion, the second value of our policy object variable, which would result in inspect ICMP syntax until we get to the end of the policy object variable, we process all values. Okay, so it's pretty important to understand at least this portion that is related to scripting, because you will see this loop-like syntax in at least few different objects which are predefined. So there's going to be a bunch of objects that are actually predefined on the FMC, just to simplify the typical configuration you may want to deploy on the FTD via FlexConfig. Okay, as we will see, there is also a concept of appending and prepending the content of the object as we deploy the policy on the FTD. So the logic is like this. We've got our FMC config, which is populated via the GUI. This is what you use as your primary tool for configuration of a FTD device. Now, if you say, as you define the object, if you say that you want to append the content, it is gonna be, this configuration is gonna be processed after the FMC GUI syntax. So we start with FMC config, and then we append your FlexConfig object commands, versus when you say you want to prepend, this stuff is going to be processed before FMC generated commands. So prepending might be useful when you want to clear some config, or maybe negate some of the commands just to prepare this stuff for FMC configuration, or simply for appending at a later point. And this is something that we will define within the object itself.